Welcome back to Off Ball Takes. This is your host, Yarby Laws, and this is my co-host,
Christopher Wells.
We appreciate all the support on our recent content. And before we do get started, please don't forget to like and subscribe and follow us on Instagram and TikTok at the OBT Podcast for more content and updates.
Yes, it's finally here. We're on the home stretch. We only have a few teams left. Today, we're going to be doing a couple of teams again in the Western Conference, the Golden State Warriors and the Portland Trailblazers. So we'll start off with the Warriors. Obviously, last year, right, they got off to a pretty strong start where they had 12 guys, roster of a lot of players, playing them all. I remember Lindy Waters, early season hero, starting for Golden State. It's pretty weird, pretty strange. And then eventually the 12 guys theory just kind of wore off. They started to stink, and it became pretty obvious that we got fooled, we got bamboozled, and they needed a trade to realistically improve. So we were waiting and waiting and waiting as the team kept struggling and struggling and struggling. Eventually, they finally traded for Jimmy Butler close to the trade deadline, and then the team took off, right? They did not lose very many games when Jimmy Butler came in and joined. And that was a controversial trade at the time, mainly because I think based off of what a lot of people saw in Miami, he didn't know whether or not he still had it anymore. But, he came in, and as I said, changed their lives, right? They were, 24-7 during that stretch while he was there. They ended up making their way into the playoffs. They did fall into the play-in because they lost a couple games right at the end of the regular season. Then they beat the Grizzlies in the play-in. They got to the playoffs. They took out the Rockets, who were the higher seed in 7 games, right? They were initially up 3-1, but it got to 7. And then they went into the second round against the Wolves. They beat the tar out of the Wolves in the first game, but Steph gets hurt in the first half, doesn't come back, and that pretty much ends the series. So now you're kind of hoping, if you're a Warriors fan, to build off of what you were able to do last year. Problem is, there's not really anything to build off of because they've not really done a single thing this summer. They did draft a couple of guys, but those guys have not actually been signed as of yet because everything is hinging on the Jonathan Kuminga situation, right? So with that, we're all the way in September. We actually kind of waited a while for this episode because we wanted to see what would happen with Kuminga. We got kind of fortunate that the Cam Thomas thing ended up being figured out right around the time we were going to do the Nets. But the Kuminga thing still isn't figured out. Supposedly, he's rumored to be leaning towards taking the qualifying offer, right? Which would be the worst case scenario for Golden State because then that means he can veto any trade, his salary's small, and then he'll be an unrestricted free agent at the end of the season, which means he could just walk, right? He could still get traded. He just would have to approve of wherever he goes, which means he's not going anywhere he doesn't want to go. And if you don't trade him, he'll walk, and he will probably leave the Warriors, right? I don't think he will come back if he takes the qualifying offer and then becomes an unrestricted free agent the year after, right? And it's kind of a disappointment because not a bad player at all, right? He's got talent. He's got real talent and skill, but it just seemingly has not worked with Golden State, right? Part of it's him because they want him to do more than just be a scorer. They want him to be a more versatile, well-rounded guy, in addition to being able to make the different reads, right, for other players. But then they've also mismanaged him too, right? Because he wasn't really much of a part of the rotation his first couple of seasons, right? Because they were committed to try to winning games, and they didn't really give him a lot of development time. And then the last couple of years, they kind of tried to shoehorn it in. It's the 2 timelines thing. It just has not worked. So there's blame to go pretty much all around, and it's kind of unfortunate that it's coming to this, where, like I said, I think this is the worst case scenario. They do have a handful of players that they are rumored to bring in, right? Once this Kuminga thing is officially patched up, right? They're rumored to bring in, I believe I've heard 4 guys, right? Al Horford, DeAnthony Melton, Gary Payton II, and then Seth Curry, right? Horford would be the biggest signing if they can bring him in because, he is a big, he can play both ends of the floor. He can shoot the 3 ball, he can defend, he can pass, he can pretty much do everything you would be looking for if you're Golden State in a big. The only issue is he's almost 40 years old, right? And I think he's going to probably be the starting center just because it's going to be tough, I think, to continue to ask Draymond to be the starting 5 for a whole season, 82 games. But it'll make them bigger. It'll make them more skilled. It's just against certain matchups, right? It's not the greatest thing that you could put yourself in, but he's still better than the other bigs on the roster, right? Even at this advanced age, he's better than Quentin Post. He's better than Trace Jackson Davis. They lost Kevon Looney, right? So he's a Pelican now. and that's a guy who's been there forever. So that would probably be the most impactful signing, just because I think if you can get him, and I think they will, right, then a lot of the other lineups can kind of slide themselves in place, because then you have a center that you can play decent amount of minutes, right? Last year, I believe he played 28 minutes a game, just under 28. So that's a guy that can basically play starter quality minutes. Then you can kind of patch up whatever else you need with the smaller lineups, whether it's Draymond at the 5 or, one of those other backups like Post or Jackson Davis, right? Melton, that's a guy who I guess would be coming back and returning to Golden State because he played there last year. Problem was he only played 6 games and then he tore his ACL, right? And that's kind of the tough part, is that the year before he was in Philly, but he had a bunch of back problems and only played 38 games. So in the last 2 seasons, he's played about 44-ish games, right? So he's not played a whole lot, and you're going to have to bank on that he comes back and is healthy. Before that, 77 games, then 73, then 52, then 60 and 50. So not like a great track record in terms of staying healthy, but he has had seasons where he's capable of playing more than 40 games. So that's, I think you're hoping that he's not that old, right? He's only 27. So you're hoping that maybe he can come back and have a healthy season. Then you have Gary Payton II, right, who's been there forever. We know what he can do as an athlete and as a defender. It's just the issue is he's another guy, right, who at this point, kind of older, not quite what he used to be. And he's a guy that, another one of those guys that tends to just get left open at times, right? He doesn't take a lot of threes. Last year, he shot 33% from 3, right, which had been the lowest in a while. Again, he only attempts barely over 1.5 threes a game. But it felt like that most of his best games came post Jimmy Butler trade. Before that, he looked kind of like he might be close to being washed. So maybe he'll be better just because you have Jimmy Butler, but he's still 32, going to be 33. So I don't really expect him to be better than he was last year. And then Seth Curry, right? He's a guy that's just a professional 3-point shooter, right? He's been around the league now for a while. Last year he played 68 games for Charlotte, but only 15 minutes a game. He really hasn't been a guy that's played a whole lot in the last couple of seasons, just because he's mainly been a bench guy, right? He used to be a starter, but now, that's a guy that kind of rounds out the end of your bench. So, I mean, he could be a guy that could just be out, like a Buddy Hield. He could be out there for X amount of stretches and get up some open shots, and he can knock them down. It's just how much can you really rely on him? So, assuming that they get all those guys and assuming Kuminga comes back, I mean, that's okay. I mean, at the end of the day, you got a center. But the problem is that I think if Kuminga takes the qualifying offer, which he's supposed to do, I think that probably caps what you could realistically do at the deadline. And ideally, you want to do all this before you have to go through the trade deadline, right? You know what I mean? Like, that's kind of the big issue there, where you're banking on plugging in a lot of holes by the time we get to the trade deadline. But like I said, his salary is going to be so small. And also, you're going to be bringing in a guy who doesn't want to be there. And that's another issue where it's kind of hard to ask a guy who doesn't want to be there to be like, hey, can you come in and be the best version of yourself? Now, he's young, right? He can still get better, but it's pretty clear he just does not want to be there anymore. So that's the problem that I have with the makeup of this team, is that, like, you like the duo. Steph and Jimmy clearly were proven that they can win a ton of games and they can be a threat in the playoffs. They could be one of those teams that come playoff time could be better than they were in the regular season. And then obviously you throw Draymond in there as well. You're hoping to maybe have Podziemski or Moses Moody or one of those other young guys get a little bit better. But I still think without maybe a number 3 offensive guy who could get you like 15 or more a night, I think that is kind of hard to bank on, because it's just a lot of these other guys where just on any given night, yeah, they could get hot just because they're going to get a lot of open shots based off of Steph and Jimmy. But I feel like they're not guys, ideally, that you can really trust to get you through an 82-game regular season. And so for them, I think their floor as a regular season team is probably lower than what their playoff floor could be. Because I think in the playoffs, like I said, they have enough high-end talent and they play smart. They can defend, where they could knock out one of those higher seeds. But I just think I don't see them being able to win multiple playoff rounds where you can get to the conference finals, get out of the Western Conference finals, and get to the finals and actually win the championship. I don't think they can be able to do that. They could be a contender because of the guys that they have, and there's the potential to improve around the margins at some point. But championship team, I think, is a little bit too much to ask. And you still have the issue of it's still a team that's largely based around older players, right? You got Jimmy Butler, who's 36, Draymond, who's 35, he'll be 36, and then Steph is 37, he'll be 38. Then, assuming you add Al Horford, 38 will be 39, right? And then, Gary Payton, 32, 33. That's a lot of guys that'll be a big part of the rotation who are older, kind of like the Clippers, right? But I still feel like regular season wise, I think it's going to be a tall task for them to be a top 4 seed in the Western Conference. I mean, if everything goes well, maybe they could get there, but the likelihood is probably that it'll probably be about halfway, where like Jimmy Butler doesn't play 70 plus games, right? He's might be like 60, something like that. And then you have to manage his minutes, manage Steph's minutes, manage Draymond and Horford's minutes. And like I said, that probably results somewhere between, I don't know, like 4 to 8 in the Western Conference in the standings. But if they get the right matchup, they could knock somebody out and, completely kind of flip the map. Kind of like what they were able to do last year. But I think championship is probably a tall task for them. I don't know if I can bank on that this year.
Not at all.
I give him a D. I give him a D.
Yeah, I'm going a notch worse. I'm giving him an F. I'm not dealing in their hypothetical situations until it happens, right? Like I can't grade them based off of a rumor. Like in theory, yeah, it's nice. Like, and all those guys that you mentioned that they could potentially sign are all veterans that would definitely help them out in the regular season and most likely the postseason as well. But I have to go with what the roster looks like right now and as constructed right now. I mean, it's practically running it back without Kevon Looney, pretty much. You do add, a couple of guys. I think Alex Tuhey and Will Richard. I mean, I don't think those are difference makers if you want me to be completely honest. So it's tough. Like, I like the pairing of Steph and Jimmy, but at the same time, I just don't know what the ceiling is realistically because it's not prime Steph and it's not prime Jimmy. Granted, these guys are amazing players, right? And we all know that as long as you do have Steph, you do have a chance. But I just think now, after what I saw last year in the postseason, I think there's a clear cap as to what this team can realistically do. The Kuminga situation, I think that's the thing that's really bogging the grade down because even if they were able to come up with a solution and have him stay on the team, he's still going to be like, I feel like in Steve Kerr purgatory or something where like
it's not a good fit.
Yeah, the trust, we already talked about this in the regular season and postseason, right? The trust has been dissolved into pretty much nothing from both sides. So like I think it would have been better to, get a trade done. Granted, that's kind of out of their control. It depends on the market, and I don't think there was really a market for Kuminga, but regardless, you got to make something shake, and they didn't. They did absolutely nothing in the Kuminga department, which, kind of coincided with not doing anything at all in the offseason, except for drafting, a couple of guys and letting Looney go or whatever. So that's where it's like it would have been a successful offseason, I think, if they would have just handled things the right way, gotten the Kuminga situation squared away, and then signed the guys that you're talking about. But as for right now, I have to give them an F because they did absolutely nothing in a Western Conference that pretty much got stronger, and they didn't move up a notch at all. So I think I agree with you. Title aspirations are definitely a long shot, out of reach for sure. I think this team could get to the second round, but not out of it. Not with how competitive the Western Conference is. I just don't see that happening.
Right, and that's the thing is you would need to see some type of decent change with this roster, I think, for you to feel, even after they potentially sign those rumored guys, they would still have to do more, I think, to be able to get to
and you'd have to have internal development, which I don't think I don't think those guys are capable of it. I don't think Pods can take a leap. I don't think Davis can I don't think any of those guys can take a leap.
Yeah, and that's the interesting thing with Kuminga because, they had that record with Jimmy Butler, but Kuminga only played in 47 games, right? I mean, he had that ankle injury that kept him out. So really, he wasn't that much of a part of their success post Jimmy Butler trade. Like he played in some of those games, but most of the time it wasn't really him. It was just kind of like everybody else around those guys was playing better. Jimmy obviously makes things better on both ends of the floor. So, I was going to ask, because I was listening to what you were saying, So you mentioned that based off of what you saw in the playoffs, you feel like there was a cap set on the team. What did you see in the playoffs based off of last postseason that made you feel that way? Was it based off of like Steph's injury? Was
Mm.
it based off of like just other stuff on the roster? Because I feel like you could point to that injury as maybe like, oh, if he's healthy, maybe they beat Minnesota. Of course, you could say maybe they don't. But what did you see?
I
Just
mean,
because I was just
first of all, I want to start with the first round matchup, which was the Rockets, right? They got pushed to
okay.
the brink. Granted, there were a lot of things and factors in that series or whatever, but if you go back and look at it, it was a lot of Jimmy and Steph, right? And not a lot elsewhere. I mean, granted, you had the Buddy Hield games, where he pops off, hits timely shots. Cool, that's fine. But at the end of the day, I feel like it's a little bit too much pressure on Jimmy and Steph to carry the load offensively when you have guys who are way too inconsistent, right? Like Pods, like I feel like if he elevates his play, then that's not a 7-game series. That's more like a 5-game series. But are you going to get that realistically? Probably not. And then in the Minnesota series, everything just went kaput when Steph, got hurt. So we all knew what was coming with that. But I just think offensively, schematically, right, they have a limit because they don't have options outside of their stars that give them, I guess, the juice off the bench in the second unit. The big man scheming is awkward as well, too, because can you rely on Quinton Post defensively? Absolutely not. Can you rely on him offensively? Maybe, but he has to hit his shot. So that's where
why they're going to get Horford.
Exactly. That's why I'm like, in theory, Horford would be nice, but I'm not dealing with theories here. So that's kind of my concern, where I think there's gaping holes on this team that they could fill, but didn't fill in the offseason, and they're waiting for the whole Kuminga thing to die down or whatever. But at the end of the day, I think there's clearly a cap, and we saw it last year.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of what we were both kind of hinting at, is the fact that, like I said, I felt like they need like some type of consistent 15-plus point per game score that could ideally start, right?
Yeah.
Where like say like Pods, maybe some of what Pods can do, but also just better offensively. And he's had some big offensive games for them. He had like a couple of games against Houston where he kind of tortured them, and part of that was, but a lot of that was him getting open opportunities with Steph and Jimmy. But like it'd be nice to have a guy who could probably do a little bit more than just play off those guys, like maybe get their own. And that's not quite as what he does consistently. I think he could do that in the regular season for stretches, but over 82 games, there's going to be, like you said, a little bit more hot and cold there. And that's the type of player that it feels like they're missing. And ideally, that would be Kuminga, in addition to the other stuff you can do as an athlete. But that's the part that hasn't worked out. There's been talks about how, they passed up on a couple of trades, right? Because you mentioned, like, yeah, the trade market was kind of thin, where it was like Kuminga for, what was it, like Nick Richards and Royce O'Neal and, maybe one other bench guy, or like for Sacramento, right? It's been like Malik Monk, right? Or I think the first offer was like Devin Carter and Dario Saric.
Right.
Then there was another one where it was like Malik Monk. And it's like, yeah, those type of players would probably help. It would just kind of suck to just be like, yeah, we're going to take Kuminga and just turn them into role players, because it feels like you need somebody that's a little bit better than a role player, ideally, if you're going to put this team into, like I said, the number 1, number 2 tier. It feels like they're probably like, I mean, we'll probably do Western Conference tiers, after we do all of our teams, but it feels like they're not in tier 1 and then tier 2, somewhere between tier 2, tier 3, right? Like whether or not like you have a bunch of teams in tier 2, some people only have like 2 teams in tier 2. But they're not in the elite tier, I would say. Like they could be like a top 10 team NBA wise, but the problem is like you need to probably be closer to like top 5 in order to realistically win the championship. And I don't think they can get there, like you said, with the offensive limitations that they have. Because we did say that in the playoffs last year, and even before the playoffs, where like you said, it was way too much Steph and Jimmy, where those guys all have to play like 40 minutes and have to play well for the most part just to be able to win, unless somebody got hot, but you just couldn't bank on that. And these guys, like you said, will help. And like I said, or I think these guys will help as well, but they're still not on the team, and you still have to do more than that. And that's not probably going to happen until the trade deadline, if it even happens at all. Because I don't necessarily know if the ownership is going to be willing to do anything if it costs them like a decent amount. I mean, they don't have a whole lot at this point anyways, but like I
Yeah.
don't think Joe Lacob is going to give up like multiple firsts and give up the farm to get something. I think he's probably planning post stuff, which doesn't sound good at all, but I think that's what he's doing. I don't think he's, all that into the idea of like paying up now to try to, put together one last championship run. And you
Yeah.
can argue like whether or not like that's a good thing or a bad thing. It's not really a good thing,
No.
but especially because you still have your franchise guy, and once he's gone, you're not going to be good.
Yep. You're
But
done.
yeah, but at the same time, what's out there right now, and that's why we kind of said years ago, well, the first year we did this podcast, when there were rumors about maybe they go after OG Anunoby, maybe they go after Siakam, we said, yeah, go do it, because what's the likelihood that those young guys are going to amount to those type of players? In fairness, Poole was able to get there the championship year, but none of the other guys have gotten there at all, right? All those guys have mostly been decent regular season players, but that's not Siakam. That's not OG Anunoby.
Mm-mm.
Those guys are, really good.
Yeah,
I mean,
very
especially
elite.
Siakam. I mean, he was the second best or one of the three best players on a championship team.
Yeah.
A game away from being a two-time champion and the second best player on another championship team.
Exactly.
So, yeah, so that part is the part where you're kind of regretting not doing that now. And at the time, in fairness, I don't necessarily think a lot of teams would be like, all right, we won the championship, so now we're going to trade all these young guys and then continue to go on. I don't know if a team would do that. I think they would give it a year. But looking back, hindsight being 2020, that was a mistake. But at the time, we called it, right? We said that they should have done that. So, we can take the quote-unquote victory lap. But, now you're kind of in a spot where the Butler trade saved you. It was able to extend the timeline because you were probably staring at mediocre team where like they're not terrible, but they're not going to be in the mix. They'll be like in the play-in, barely in the play-in, like the year before. And then that would kind of be a suckish way to go out, right? Especially with Steph, because you want to see him have a chance to compete along with the other older guys. But now they don't have to worry about that. But I don't think they can win the championship just because I don't feel like they have enough offensive firepower after those guys to be able to compete with the best teams in the league, right? And then in addition to the age factor where you're going to have to bank on, okay, we know that Steph or Jimmy could be the best player in a series against, a team like Houston last year who doesn't have like a superstar on their team, but you're also going to then you're going to have to bank on that happening against a team like Oklahoma City, like against a team like Denver, which, yeah, it could happen depending on the matchup, but 4 out of 7 times against all of those teams, I think is unlikely. And that's okay, I guess, just because of the age of the guys. And it's still great that they can be in this mix. But as of right now, this is not it, I would say.
Yeah, I agree with you.
Yeah. So let us know your thoughts and comments about the Warriors, whether or not you think that with the moves that they're rumored to make, along with Kuminga and whatever else they do, whether or not they can make one last run. And what you would do in order to improve the roster. But let us know. So now moving on, going into a team that's got a little bit of different expectations here, and that's the Portland Trailblazers, right? This is a team where they've been a young team on the rise in rebuild mode, right, since they traded Damian Lillard. And who would have thought, right? One of their, probably their most surprising move of the offseason was to bring him back, right? But obviously for the Blazers, right, last year, they started off not that great, but the second half of the year, they were really good. They were really good on the defensive end of the floor, locking teams up. Just the issue was the offensive end of the floor. Scoot Henderson, some of those other guys were playing better. They had other injuries to some guys, like Ayton didn't play as much, so then it's like we get more Klingon, so we get more defense. And, Jeremy Grant is kind of, out of the rotation because he's been hurt. So they've done a lot, I mean, at this point, and including a few moves that I think were kind of surprising that caught us off guard, even in addition to the Lillard thing, right? The first move was they traded Anfernee Simons for Jrue Holiday, right? Who was on the Celtics, won the championship with them. Then after his second year there, gets moved. So now he's going to join what will still kind of be like a crowded guard rotation in Portland. In fairness, Lillard won't be playing because he's got the torn Achilles. But we know he's at his peak, he was an elite defender, one of the best defensive players in the league. He fit perfectly in Boston, right, where he kind of lowered his usage, lowered his role, right? And was able to adapt his game to fit what Boston was asking for him. So I think he's a great teammate, locker room guy that I think those Portland guards can learn a lot from. I'm curious whether or not he'll start. I don't know if he will, because you do have the young guys that probably should be starting and playing the most, right? And Scoot and Shaedon Sharpe, but I'm sure he will play. Doesn't sound like he's going to get moved anytime soon. And he still has 2 more years after this deal, or after this year, right? He's got $32 million this year, $35 million the next, and then a $37 million player option in 2028, which I assume he will pick up. Damian Lillard was signed to a 3-year, $42 million deal, right? The third year being a player option. As I already said, he's not going to play this year, but he'll come back sometime the year after that, and we'll see what his role is. This was definitely a surprise. I mean, I guess the first part of it that was the shocker was him getting waived and stretched by Milwaukee anyways. You knew he wasn't going to play, but that part was surprising, and then you just kind of assumed that he would go to some contender, right, and just take like the minimum or whatever. But he got the most money, and this was more money than I think any of those teams could have given him, and it's where he made his bones. It's where he made most, his career, right? He's only spent, he spent what, like just 2 seasons outside of Portland. So now he'll be back there. He'll be a locker room guy for all those guys, and he's very well liked and respected around the league. So I'm sure they will love having him there, especially because, again, he can show them the ropes for all the things he's done so far in his career. So then you look at the draft, and the big move that they made in the draft was that, trade where, Cedric Coward goes to Memphis, but then they take Hansen Yang, right, who's the big man who was in China, right? Chinese Jokic, that's what they consider him, right? He's got a lot of skill offensively. He's a very good passer. We saw him in the summer league, and that was kind of the first thing that stuck out to us, right? Was just the fact that he knows how to move the ball very well and very quickly for a guy his size. I mean, he's a pretty tall human being. It's, we didn't see him take a lot of jumpers, but he seemed like he was a willing, jump shooting big man. So I'm curious to see what that looks like once he actually plays. Whether or not he can be like a good stretch 5, kind of like what Jokic can be, right? To round out that offensive game. The main thing for him is defensively, right? Because he still looked kind of slow, right? Sometimes, kind of like struggled to move his feet. You don't expect him to stay in front of guards, but just he felt like when we were watching him, he looked like he could be a potential target on the defensive end. Now, unlike the Summer League roster, he'll be playing with better defensive players than he would be playing with in the Summer League. So that may not be quite as much of a concern. Obviously, he's the center, so you always have to think about it. But I am curious to see how much he will play, especially because you already have Donovan Clingan, right, who they drafted, and then you also have Robert Williams, but with him, he just doesn't play a whole lot because unfortunately he's very injury prone. So I'm curious to see if they'll play both Young and Clingan together. Maybe, I'd be curious to see that. What does he look like as the backup center? Will there be games where maybe he starts? So there's a lot to like out of that. And then you still have all those other guys on the roster, Scoot Henderson, Denny Avdia, who they traded for from the Washington Wizards. A couple of those other guys like Chris Murray and Rayon Rupert, who just haven't done a whole lot so far in what we've seen. Tamani Kamara, right, kind of coming alive as one of the big 3-and-D wings that we have in this league. So they have a lot of players that we like. And then when you combine the Lillard move and then the draft move, I mean, it's fine. I mean, though I wasn't really expecting them to have like a big significant offseason. I kind of like some of what they did. The Holiday trade is still weird just because you would think, if you're going to trade Anfernee Simons, maybe you just kind of get a player of maybe like a similar age and, value or whatever. But, I guess maybe they're thinking maybe they have a chance to make the playoffs, which I don't know if they're going to be able to do that. But I don't really hate any of what they did. I still feel like with Simons, it would have been nice to have not taken on a longer term contract from an older player. Maybe they can flip it. We'll see. But, I think the Young pick, I'm going to assume he's going to be a project. And then you brought in Damian Lillard, which is cool. And then you traded for Jrue Holiday. So, I mean, I feel like aside from that, they didn't really do a whole lot. But that's because they already have some young players in place. So I'm going to say C+. B- offseason, I think, is kind of fine because, Hansen Yang is still a project. So, could he be really good? maybe, but it's not like a pick where it's like, this is the obvious choice. This is a lock that this guy is going to be pretty good and fits in with what you're going to do. And then, like I said, the Holiday trade is kind of weird. And then, the Lillard signing is cool. So that was probably my favorite thing that I think that they did, other than, take a chance on Yang. But that's what I would say. I'd say I'll probably kind of put it at B minus.
Okay. I'm going to go with a C. I agree with, majority of what you said. I'm kind of confused by, what their thought process is here, because I feel like half of this felt like, okay, we're pretty confident in how we can maybe, shape out to look in this Western Conference, and maybe we're like a play-in team. But then the other half is like, well, we're probably not going to be that good, so let's go out and take a flyer on, Hansen Yang or whatever. And that's where I'm kind of divided, and I think that's where you get the C from, because the Jrue Holiday thing, I feel like, is one of those veteran moves where you'd feel like you're inching closer to contention, because I like the young core a lot. Like, they've got a really good defensive young core. You already have Scoot Henderson, who, I mean, like, hasn't necessarily, shown us that he's like number 3 pick yet, but he has shown us flashes and definitely taken little baby steps towards getting better and better as an NBA player, and specifically a point guard. That's a tough position to figure out, especially going into year 3 now. So what does he look like? I'm curious, but at the end of the day, I don't necessarily think they're a contender, but I think defensively they're going to be one of the scarier teams, throughout the entire year. More so than just, for a stretch or, the latter part of the season. Especially when you bring in a guy like Jrue Holiday. I think his leadership can definitely be, of use. Do they want to flip him maybe at some point during the deadline? I don't know, because I think he has 2 years left on his contract. So I think that's where people are like, what the heck is Portland doing? Trading away, Simons for that. But regardless, I think people are high on Hansen Yang. They like what they've seen. I think we're in that boat where, if it's a hit, it's a freaking hit. And I think if it's a miss, you don't necessarily feel like, all right, like we could have gotten somebody else, unless maybe Cedric Coward turns out to be a, even more of a beast than I think, majority of people think he's going to be, or somebody else from that draft class pops off. But nonetheless, I mean, I think it's a fair gamble. And then obviously bringing back Dame, that's pretty cool, right? Like, he's going to end his career pretty much as a Portland Trailblazer. That's pretty dope. But in terms of contention, right, I don't think this team is as far along as maybe they think. Right. I don't think that I think their ceiling absolutely could be like the bottom part of the play-in, like 10. Mm-hmm. But I don't think they could go much higher than that. So that's why I'm giving them a C, and I'm kind of confused about it. Really, I wanted to give them a D, but I do like certain things that they have in place. The defensive young core, you build on top of that with Jrue Holiday and Hansen Yang. It's a good pick, in my opinion. So shout out to Portland.
Right, and I kind of like what you mentioned where you said, like, there's different parts of this that you like, and then different parts where you're like, huh? What's going on here? Yeah. And like you said with Portland, they're one of those teams where I think they probably see themselves as being better than what they're actually going to be.
Exactly.
Because we already know going into the season, especially in the West, pretty much almost every team in the Western Conference is going to go into the season with, some type of playoff projection, right? We're like, you go all the way down. The only team where they're like, yeah, we're definitely not making the playoffs, and we know it, is Utah. Everyone else is kind of in the mix of like, yeah, let's make the playoffs. Let's go for it. Even a team like a Phoenix, right? Because they don't have their picks. So they don't really have a choice but to try to be as good as they can. Mm-hmm. But a lot of those teams won't be as good as they think. The bottom teams more so I'm talking about. With Portland, really, to be honest, as where they, depending on like how good they can really be, probably going to be based off of like Scoot Henderson and like how realistically can he take like a real leap of some sorts. Because as you've mentioned, he's been a point guard in this league, but there's been like a lot of stretches where, there's going to be nights where he really struggles. And then there's other nights where we did see some flashes of him looking pretty good, but he's going to have to continue to put it together. He still has some issues with his perimeter shooting where, like if you look at different parts of last season, right, you can see a couple stretches where, hey, this guy seemingly has figured out some different aspects of his jump shot. And then there's other times where it's like, yeah, the jump shot is still a work in progress. Actually, to be honest, if you look at his splits, pre-All-Star break, right, versus post-All-Star break, because post-All-Star break was more so the stretch where Portland was winning a lot. And, when you look at it, right, during the pre-All-Star break, he was at 36.5% from three. And then post-All-Star break, he was at 33%. But on the season, he shot 35%. So if he could be somewhere around that just from three alone, that's already going to change a lot of what he can, what his ceiling can be offensively. Because he still is, even though he's kind of a big guy, he's just not that tall, right? Like we mentioned, one of the things that we saw in the summer league was, how crazy of an athlete he looked. But then as soon as he stepped on the NBA court, he doesn't stand out quite as much as an athlete, right?
Yep.
Like he's had some plays, but by and large, he's not had as many crazy athletic, this is one of the best athletic plays we've seen all year type of plays. And part of that's just because he's kind of small, right? Like even if you look at some of the more athletic guards in the league, they're a little bit bigger, right? Like John Wall, right, would be in that mix. I know Scoot's listed as 6'3". I don't know. He looks smaller than 6'3".
He's 6'2", 6'1", maybe, if you want me to be honest.
Yeah, and those are all supposed to be their heights without shoes, but he looks a little smaller to me, but I could just be wrong. But either way, that's what I think is a lot of it's gonna hinge on, and him continuing to learn how to run the offense, make the right play, make the right passes and reads, and kind of find out how to also play at different speeds and different styles, because that's kind of a big part
Can
of
he
what
shoot?
Yeah, exactly. That's a lot of what being a point guard is all about. Not speaking from experience, of course. I don't want to make it seem like that, but just as a whole, that's where it kind of feels like a lot of that is going to have to come from, because all the other guys in place, right, like are pretty good complementary pieces, right? Like Denny Avdia played really well for the Portland Trailblazers last year. I mean, he gave them 17 points, 7 rebounds, 4 assists a game, all while, defending at a high level and, giving them quality offensive production. Shaedon Sharpe, right? You look at him, he's a guy where he didn't shoot the ball quite as well as last year, but he's a great athlete. He's got size, and I think he can be another complimentary guy. Just a matter of, again, can he, like Scoot, also figure it out on the defensive end? Because with as athletic as those guys are, that should be a positive defensive minded backcourt, even though they have other good defensive players. And then, like I mentioned, all the other guys, right? Like Tamani Kamara, and even a guy like a Donovan Clingan, right? That's another guy where we liked him in the draft, right? We didn't really know what to expect from him on the offensive end of the floor, just because, in college, it's just a different game, right? He was more like a role guy in college, like, because we compared him with Edie, where Edie's a post guy, and then Clingan was more of like a cleanup type of guy on the offensive end. And that's what he looks like, at least as of right now in the NBA, where his offense is still a work in progress, where, if it's not somewhere around the rim, right, that's probably where it's going to be a little bit of a struggle. And it's not like he's a post guy. It's more so, like I said, like a screen and roll, put back guy. He shot some threes last year at different points. I mean, he shot only 29%. So, it seems like he's going to try to add that to his game. Don't really feel like that has to be a part of his game. But either way, there's also some flashes of some passing. Of course, shot blocking, he averaged almost 2 blocks a game in 20 minutes a game. So that's pretty good.
Yeah.
So I like his defensive and rebounding upside, but the offense looks a little bit like a step behind. But I think that could get better as long as the playmaking gets better in Portland, which, like I said, that's where Scoot and Shaedon Sharpe come in. And then, the veterans on the roster outside of Holiday, Jeremy Grant, I don't know what happened to him last year. I mean, I guess his counting stats don't look horrible, but then when you actually take a look, yeah, no, they're pretty bad. I mean, he went from 21 points to 14 a game, and the shooting went off a cliff, right?
Yeah.
45 from the field and 40 from three last year, 37 from the field and 36.5% from three last year. So that's not great. And I know, of course, field goal percentage and 3-point percentage, a lot of people now use like true shooting and effective field goal, but just know, shooting under 40% from the field, I don't have to have like super advanced stats from that, especially because he's an offensive minded guy. He's not like a guy that's known for his defense or known for his rebounding or shot blocking anymore at this point, right?
Sure.
He kind of was like that when he came into the league, but not really anymore. So that's kind of weird. And his contract, he still has quite a few seasons under contract, right? He's not free until 27, 28, where he's got a player option. So that pretty much means 28, 29 season is when he'll probably be on another team, if not out of the league, who knows? So, Matisse Thybulle, right? That's a guy who just has barely played. He's been hurt. And that's kind of been an issue for him for a decent chunk of his career, where when he plays, he's a great defender. Probably not a guy that, is like a guy that you always are going to put on the best player every night, but he can do a lot of stuff defensively. It's just he can't stay healthy, and his offense is always a question. Although his last healthy stretch, he shot well from three. But the main focus of this roster is the young guys, right? And their growth is going to probably determine how good this team can realistically be next season. And those are the guys to be high on. It's just a matter of, what are they going to look like? Like, what is Scoot going to look like in year 3? Can he, like, as we already said, can he finally take the step towards being good, like looking really good close to every night? Can he get there? Because I think by year 3, that's when you should probably get to the point where, like, yeah, of course, everyone has bad games, but like, we shouldn't really question whether or not this guy is like, is he actually
top 3 pick?
Good?
Right.
Right. So, and maybe it seems like he probably won't get to the levels that I think, a lot of people expected he'll get to. Of course, he's still very young. He's only 21 years old. So there's still plenty of time and plenty of room to grow. But, I don't know. That's the part where it's kind of tough to really, see as of right now. But at the very least, I like you said, I like this young core. I like this group. But I feel like, as I already said, this is going to be one of those teams that by the time we get to the deadline is going to be like, can we move some of these guys now? Not the young players, but just maybe some of the other pieces on the roster. Because I don't see them being able to crack that.
Yeah,
top,
I don't either.
Yeah, I don't see. I think it would be a very tall task for them to get to that. 10 is, like you said, probably the best case scenario. I think if
even then,
because just a couple. Because of course we'll do our Western Conference teams eventually, but take all the teams that you expect to probably be playoff teams, like top 1 to 8 seeds, unless something goes wrong. They'd still have to be better than a couple of teams that I think most people expect off the bat to be better. Like they'd have to be better than Memphis. They'd have to be better than maybe Dallas, better than San Antonio. And that might be a tall task because they just don't have as good of high-end talent as those teams do. Now, maybe one of those teams gets hurt, and then that kind of just removes them from the conversation. But that's kind of the main thing that you'd have to bank on, right? That's okay. The main thing I need to see is, like, I need to see those young guys get better. But if they do, the wins will come. I just don't think it'll amount to a top 10 seed.
Yeah.
Yeah, so if we look at their over-under, which I guess we should also do with Golden State, might as well. So Portland's over-under is 33.5. So can we bank on them being over 33.5 wins?
Ooh, what did they go last year?
Last year, I think they won 35 games.
They won, 30, 36, and 46. Okay. That's a tough one. Give me the slight over.
Okay.
Give me slight, very slight, because I'm expecting, some of the guys to look really, really good. Like I'm expecting big things probably from Avdia, Shaden Sharp. Like I'm expecting good things from the young guys, which I think will translate into probably like a couple more wins, but definitely not enough to the point where they're going to be a contender or a play-in team.
Yeah, I would say slight over as well because they won 36 last year, but the Western Conference will be tougher. But that's also probably why the over/under is lower. But I could see them being like better than 33 wins. But in order to get to like 40,
no,
then like that's where you'd have to have, like I said, best case scenario. I think that might be a little tough unless one of those other teams gets hurt and then they kind of slide in as the next group, or something went crazy right in terms of like one of those guys is like a star level player.
Yeah, right.
Which,
if breaks out.
Yeah, like if he has a breakout season, that I don't think. I mean, if he gets to a level that I don't think quite as many people are expecting at this point, then that's where they would get there. But if he takes like a relatively normal leap where he looks better and looks good, then they would still probably be like mid-30s.
Yep, I agree.
And then for Golden State, their over/under is 45.5. What do we think of that?
45?
Yeah. They won 47 last year.
Give me the under.
I was going to go over, but
I'm going under. Give me the under.
You're going under?
Yeah,
okay.
Give me the under.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't
I
don't like the roster. I'm just going to keep it a stack. I mean, like, sure, regular season they're probably going to be good, and that take is probably going to come back to bite me in the butt. But postseason wise, not really hype on this team. Obviously, like I said, the Steph factor is always going to be there, but it's the guys outside of Steph and Jimmy that worry me, in terms of what they're going to be able to provide on a nightly basis. And what if Steph's health, hopefully it doesn't, but, what if he starts to become even more injury prone? Who knows? So we'll see what they look like, but I think they take a little bit of a step back.
Well, yeah, and again, like the Western Conference is going to be better. So just because, so a team like standings wise could be in a similar spot, but it could be like less wins. We talked about that last season, right? Where we're like, oh, a team like Orlando, should win, could win like 47 games or something like that, but then like move a spot up or something like they didn't because they were hurt. But just stuff like that can happen all the time. So
Yeah.
we'll see where Portland is and where Golden State is in the standings. So let us know your thoughts in the comments about the Portland Trailblazers and what you thought of their offseason and what you think of their young players. But now, getting into some news and rumors. I mean, not like a ton of crazy news and whatnot around the NBA. Of course, we're still waiting for the outcome of the Clippers situation, but we're not going to know anything about that for probably a while because I mean, stuff like that is going to take a minute for them to figure out and get all the other information that they need. We did have a couple of, I guess, rumors, I suppose. I mean, there was a thing about Ben Simmons where he got an offer from the Knicks, but he turned it down, and it was kind of like what we talked about, where he's probably was looking for more than a minimum contract. But if he doesn't, maybe he just retires. But I mean, if he was on the team, I mean, I guess that's a okay signing. I mean, he didn't really do much for the Clippers, I think, last year, but they just need bodies, I guess. But,
Yeah, I mean, realistically, how much would he
Right.
play though? Like, I
Right.
don't know how much he plays, so
Right.
maybe it's a good
Yeah,
thing
and
he's
then
not on the team.
yeah, and then we did get from Mark Stein, we got kind of a reopening about the Wiggins thing, right? We talked about it maybe like a month or so ago about the idea of the Lakers being interested in going after Andrew Wiggins, right? And now they basically talked about like since Luka signed his extension, they would be interested in a player like that. The main thing is that, as we've talked about before, they don't want to give up like a pick plus Rui and whatever. They would probably rather do like one or the other or whatever else it would take to get to that point. If they could get him, like that's a good acquisition because it's a two-way wing and it's a type of player that kind of fits. But, what's the package? What does it look like? I think you said you would be for that if you're the Lakers. I think you said you would do it. If I'm not mistaken, right? And I think
Yeah.
I said that as well. It's
Yeah.
just a matter of will it actually happen. And it probably won't happen anytime soon because Miami's going to have to kind of like some of these other teams figure out what they're going to do with their team and then see what happens in the season and then maybe they stink and then they were like, all right, let's start selling off some of these guys. Who knows?
Yeah, I'd do it in a heartbeat.
So would you give up both the first and Rui? Because I think that's the sticking point with the Lakers.
I'd do it. Screw it. At that point.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't think they're gonna do both, so that means that we're probably gonna wait a while if it happens. But I don't think they're gonna do both because it just seems like they're kind of protective about some of that stuff.
Yeah, the assets. I get it.
Yeah, the assets, and they don't have like a ton to give up anyways because they have a lot of their picks, but they can't trade a lot of them because of the timing of some of those years of picks with the Stepien rule and whatnot. So,
Right,
like,
right.
I mean, yeah, they don't have a ton to give up, so they'd have to kind of figure that out. And then it's like, oh, well, I think the ideal thing for them that they would probably love is if they could get Wiggins and keep Rui, of course. But you'd still have to. But then it's like, who wants Vanderbilt's contract? Like, then you'd have to kind of put together contracts that I don't think all those teams would want. Like, they have expirings, but they don't have as much value because does a team want Maxi Kleba? Is a team dying to have Gabe Vincent? Is a team dying to have? I mean, Vanderbilt's not an expiring, but like his contract doesn't look very good now, so that's the tricky part.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then moving on, we got some Eurobasket upsets. So the Eurobasket has been kind of crazy as of right now, where we've got some stellar performances from some of the stars who've been playing overseas, right? Stellar performances from Luka, who's had 40 in a game and had a triple double in another. Of course, continuous stellar play from Giannis. Markkanen and Şengün, two other guys that have played great so far in the Eurobasket. But we did have a couple of teams. Serbia, who was the favorite, got knocked out. And then France also got knocked out. So now that kind of sets up, supposedly Germany is supposed to be the favorite from here on out, right? That's the team with like the Wagner brothers, and although Mo is not playing because of the ACL, but Schroeder's there as well. They're supposed to play Slovenia, Lithuania, and Greece will play, and then Turkey's still around playing well, playing Poland, Finland, and Georgia will play. So there's been kind of crazy. A lot of really great games. It's just it would be nice to actually find where to watch them. Without having to kind of, some people have resorted to other ways, but I mean, just as a whole, it's not very easy to go out and just find them.
Yeah, I mean it's been pretty entertaining. It feels like mini Olympics or something like that.
Right.
With all the talent and all over the world and so many
And all
standout
right.
European players, and yeah, it's just been really really cool to watch for sure. It's just like
Yeah.
you said, the accessibility factor is a little tough.
Yeah. And they're playing hard too. Like they all want to compete and win this thing because this
Yeah,
means a lot to a lot of those guys. And as we already mentioned before, many of those guys, it's important that they show how well they're playing here because for some of these teams, like their season is going to be based off some of these guys. Like say for if you're a Rockets fan, this is what you want to see from Şengün, right? Because he's still a young guy that's continuing to get better each year, and you want to see him put up big numbers for a team like this. Or
yeah,
if you're the Lakers, right? This is what you love seeing from Luka, where he looks like he's in better shape, playing well on both ends of the floor. Or even if you're a Jazz fan, right? Like with the way Markkanen's been playing, if he can kind of carry that into the regular season for Utah, that could help make them quote unquote better. But more importantly, maybe it might be able to, if he wants to go somewhere else, then that might make another team more interested in trading for him, right? Where
yeah.
the marketing we saw last season, that's not quite as desirable of a contract. Just and then and that could just have been bad team, so maybe just they're trying to lose games, and so that kind of makes the stats a little bit wonky. But for a lot of these guys, this is what you want to see. It's kind of like the Olympics bump that people used to talk about.
Yep.
And then last but not least, congratulations to some of the new members of the Naismith Hall of Fame, right? Because over the weekend we did have, or excuse me, over the weekend we did have some new guys come into the Hall of Fame, including, I mean, of course we had some of the WNBA players as well, like Maya Moore, Sue Bird, but we also had from the NBA former stars that we used to watch and grow up with, Melo and Dwight Howard, getting into the Hall of Fame. So congrats to them, right? So now they're immortalized, right, in terms of basketball, and they had a big impact on the league. Of course, we watched them a lot, and now their names are up there now, so that's pretty cool. And both of those guys, had really fun careers to watch. A lot of drama at different points, right? Obviously, for Dwight, he was able to cap it off with a championship. But of course, Melo is always going to be like in the NBA culture sphere as well, right? Because everybody, if you follow the NBA, everybody knows who he is, and everybody to some extent, right, likes something that he brings to the game, whether it's his style of play or kind of like just some of the fashion and everything else. So hats off to both of those guys for great careers.
Yeah, both those guys. Shout out to them. Melo obviously with the cultural impact, and obviously tons of people modeled their game after him.
Mhm.
And shout out to Dwight too, because I feel like it's not talked about enough, but the injuries really derailed his career. Like if he didn't get hurt, especially the back injuries and stuff, oh man, like we might be talking about his career in a completely different way. But regardless, shout out to both those guys. They deserve it no matter what.
Yeah, and for Dwight, you kind of mentioned a good point where he was not on the 75 all-time list, but he was in the Hall of Fame. And and some of that could have just been like you said, that latter part of his career, right? Where he had the back injuries, turned him into a little bit of a different player, in a relatively quick fashion. But he was able to kind of figure out how to adapt his game towards being, a guy that's not like a star guy. Like I remember for the Lakers, right? He was kind of seemingly on his way out of the league, right? And he was able to, turn into a productive role player for them where he's the backup big off the bench, rebounding and blocking shots and being physical. And, not every star player can do stuff like that. For a lot of guys who are former stars, it's very difficult, I think, for them to be able to make that transition. For some of those guys, they want to just go out on top, where like, all right, once I'm at the point where I can't be like a star level player, I'm done. I'm not going to try to be like a guy that comes off the bench and contributes. And they can do whatever they want. It's just, credit to him because he was a part of a championship team. And as you mentioned for Melo, and as I said, the cultural impact as well. We all knew at least one or two people growing up, right? Like you said, that would, try to mimic and imitate a lot of the
Yeah,
different parts of his game, right?
the
Whether or not it's
triple threat.
the post up. Yeah, whether or not it's the triple threats, the post ups, the turnarounds, or something to do with the rebounding, right? Like we all knew at least one guy or girl that was like that.
True that.
Yeah. Well, that's pretty much it for today's episode of Off Ball Takes. We will close it out as we normally do with one of those polls that we always kind of talk about for our IG, and we asked the question of, are the Clippers in trouble? Right. This was tied to our last short. And 100% of responders said yes. Of course, all alleged. So we're gonna have to wait and see what the NBA finds and what they come up with. But what had already been put out there, you didn't feel great about it. But I think ideally, what you probably want, what you're hoping for, is that the NBA has a thorough investigation, and then they come out of it and they're like, yeah, we didn't find that the Clippers did anything against the rules, and then we can just kind of move on and just kind of pretend like it didn't happen. You don't really want necessarily a situation where they do find stuff and then they have to start doling out punishments, because once that happens, obviously you need the NBA to do something to protect the integrity. But from that point onward, everybody's always going to question, like, well, now this guy's going to be taking less money because he's getting paid on the side for X, Y, and Z. So we'll see what happens.
Yeah, it would be unfortunate if it is, true, to the extent that's being alleged, because then like you said, it's going to be a ripple effect, and then it's just going to be nonstop. Then it's probably going to spiral into other things and snowball effect. It's just going to be an NBA nightmare. So I think every NBA fan should be praying that this is completely false and fabricated.
Yes, I'm sure everybody feels that way as well.
Yeah.
So that concludes today's episode of Off Ball Takes. Again, if you want to join on these polls, always join on IG, or you can even join our Discord, right? And the Discord sometimes is popping in there. So, and of course, you can always leave comments at the OBT podcast. So on any of our socials, including our YouTube channel, and our comments. And continue to like and subscribe to help the channel grow as we get closer to the beginning of the NBA season. We're basically a month away from preseason, so we'll actually be able to have some real things to break down. We're going to try to continue to come up with some more content as the NBA season prepares to start. This is the Off Ball Takes podcast. Thanks for watching.